and I am CEO and a co-founder here at KnowAtom. We're located just north of Boston in Salem, Massachusetts, and we've been working on next generation style curriculum for about the last 13 years. And with the publishing of the next generation science standards, we're really excited that the shift from a content focus to now a skills and content focus is really taking root. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the 7 principles of effective NGSS implementation, and kind of breaking that into 2 frames. So one, what makes NGSS unique in terms of its implementation, and what's required to implement the changes successfully in the K-8 classroom. So I'd like to let you know, implementing these new standards, like any implementation, is not about one thing. And so our discussion today is not about one specific thing, but in fact, a collection of things that influence effective implementation. And so I have to apologize in advance. I have a few slides that are a little more dense or wordy than I'd like, but it's sort of the nature of our task here today. If you are on the live session, I'd like to let you know that on the right side of your screen, you will have like a box for questions. You may not be able to see that. You might have to click a little orange arrow in order to reveal the box. But feel free to drop your questions into that box, and I'll do my best. I'll try to save 15 minutes at the end of this presentation to go through any of those questions that I don't think was answered in the course of the presentation. Also, if you'd like, I would be happy to follow up with you after the session as well, if you have something specific that may not be appropriate to the general audience. And I'll give my contact information at the end, or you can drop your information into that question poll and we'll have somebody contact you. All right, so let's jump right in here. So the first bit, what makes implementing NGSS unique? Really, it's a system of instruction that needs to be developed within your district. And it's not just a system of instruction, it's instructional resources, and it's all centered around these performance expectations. And that's a bit of a departure in terms of traditional fact-based standards, because the role of higher order thinking is significantly different. In a traditional science class, when you think about Bloom's taxonomy, and this is the new version, depending on when you started teaching, you might be familiar with the old version, but nonetheless, the traditional science class focuses on lower order thinking, remembering, understanding, and applying sort of the facts of science or the facts of engineering, taking those facts and trying to apply it in a, repeat the demonstration as I have done it, or summarize what I've explained and that sort of thing. And the creating, evaluating, and analyzing is expected to happen outside of class time. With next generation science standards, because of the inclusion of science and engineering practices, this shifts, it actually flips entirely, different flipped classroom. The focus of time on learning is really on creating, evaluating, and analyzing. And also, when we talk about the focus of time on learning, it's not just the focus of the planned lesson and of the curriculum and everything else. It's the focus of the student's effort. Okay, so under a traditional science class, the focus of student effort is on remembering, understanding, and applying what has been sort of projected or shown, demonstrated. In a next generation science class, the focus of time on learning is entirely on creating, evaluating, and analyzing real world phenomena, and so on. And so what happens is that lower order thinking, obviously, we have to remember, understand, and apply concepts, but in essence, it's outside of class. We could read some nonfiction reading outside of class. Obviously, if we're creating, evaluating, and analyzing in a really robust scenario, then we're going to be able to apply that in other places. So what happens is phenomena in a next generation science classroom, what we call anchor phenomena, acts as sort of fabric or the context for students to create, evaluate, and analyze. And so thereby remembering and using terms, definitions, vocabulary, and so on. Happy to talk more about that, but pretty big difference here. And so when you think about the experience of a student in a classroom encountering content, they are doing so through an anchor phenomena, which gets unpacked into little threads, which are called investigative phenomena. So now what's happening is that a student is going from sort of a big, complex, real-world scenario like flooding, in hurricane zones or things like that, into something very specific that they can investigate, like the effect of ground matter on the collection of water on the surface of the ground. And they are going to have ideas about that. And they're going to be able to bring their ideas to life and actually observe the phenomena firsthand by comparing perhaps sand, soil, clay, and different sorts of ground matter. And so in that next generation inquiry environment, creating, evaluating, and analyzing happens simultaneously. So unfortunately, because of the nifty pyramids that people are used to, people tend to think that this is like a staircase that you climb, and that's really not the case. What in fact it is demands on critical thinking, which are interrelated. And what happens is as these skills or these critical thinking skills are exercised, they build on one another and require the lower order thinking skills, of course, but in and of themselves, those lower order thinking skills are not sufficient. And I mentioned earlier, why is this so important? Well, primarily this higher order thinking comes into play because we have three-dimensional standards, and that science and engineering practices dimension is really the dimension related to skills and thinking. And how do you apply your skills in thinking, or where do you apply them? It's to the content, where you also observe the sort of the systems dynamics of the content. And that's why when you see the standards rendered this way, it's a performance expectation. A student who has mastered this standard is able to perform the expectation of developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. But they do so in a three-dimensional context. So these skills are absolutely required. Okay, and so to build those skills, we need next generation science classrooms focusing on higher order thinking skills and doing so in a way that equips students, for the higher order and lower order thinking skills outside of class. I mean, the idea that this only happens outside of class and that doesn't is kind of a joke. But what does that functionally look like from an instructional perspective? So think about it this way, that the traditional science class, and unfortunately, this is a bigger issue once you hit middle school than when you are in elementary school. But it's this idea that teachers are the experts and they're content specialists in middle school on up, and the content flows through the teacher who distributes that information through demonstrations and explanations. And the student is a good student and proficient when they can recall and repeat and summarize. But under next generation science standards, it's all about the teacher as coach, students developing skills and using those skills to develop and use the content as they answer questions and solve problems the way that scientists and engineers do. And so what this represents is another huge shift. So the first shift that we saw is this shift from a traditional science class, focus on lower order thinking, memorize everything in the reading, how to repeat the demonstration, to higher order thinking focus. Over here, it's getting the teacher out of the role of sage on the stage and into the role of coach. And why that's important is that the vision for this system of performance expectations is that students are scientists and engineers in the classroom on an everyday basis, that being an investigator as a student and a thinker and using those science and engineering practices to develop and use the content is how the content and skills are mastered. That's why having anchor phenomena drive all of this is so important, because you need a context to apply those in. So science is specific, engineering is specific. They have specific roles now under these standards. under prior standards, that wasn't the case. It was more blurred, and this idea, people thought that they were kind of integrated, but kind of had some fuzzy ideas about that. Science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists answer questions by developing and using experiments. Engineers identify and solve problems by prototyping technology, using their knowledge of science. And what we're hinting at here at the center with math is that math is a tool for quantifying, but also evaluating, communicating our results, whether we're scientists or engineers. And also implicit in all of this is the need for English language arts skills. So I guess bringing this all together, essentially that we're talking about a system of instruction that shifts the expectations of the student and the teacher, so that the student is in the role of scientist, living out this sort of cycle of innovation on an everyday basis in order to encounter and use the content and develop the skills. And the teacher takes a skillful leader's role of coaching that student or the classroom through this process over time. And so it's very dynamic. Some other elements that are unique about these new standards that are barriers that there are ways to deal with is beliefs that are a part of the culture of particularly the American educational setting. The belief that elementary teachers are not content specialists and therefore they're at a disadvantage. The belief that content specialists are necessarily in some way advantaged under these standards, because neither is necessarily true. Experience. Very few educators have seen or experienced themselves as students high quality science and engineering pedagogy in action. That's one of the greatest barriers is, what does this really look like? How can I create an environment that I've never experienced myself? And that leads right into the next one. Administrators don't necessarily know the signs of effective NGSS instruction. So connecting that administrator, particularly administrators who are in coaching or evaluative roles, with examples and models of effective instruction is so key, because oftentimes administrators are looking for things that support a traditional model of instruction and not something that supports a next generation model of instruction. Walking into a classroom and saying, what standard are you teaching today, is one of a common pitfall. Not taking the opportunity to step into the classroom and feel the student's experience and use that as a low stakes formative assessment for the teacher. Cost is another piece about these standards that's important. These next generation science standards are inquiry-based standards. A lot of people are trying to get around this with things like ebooks and electronic simulations and whatever. Good luck, because really this is about investigative phenomena happening in the classroom, and ebooks and simulations are an artist's rendition. An ebook is no different than a textbook, just in electronic form. That's it. And so materials are an issue to consider. Districts need to budget appropriately, and also not just for materials in the curriculum, but for continuous professional development, because the teachers themselves need coaching. If you're expecting students to take on the role of scientist and engineer, and you're expecting a teacher to go away from a traditional model of instruction, which is everything that they know, telling students facts and showing them demonstrations and getting them to repeat those demonstrations for themselves, then you're going to leave people hanging, and it's going to hinder the success and also buy-in of your staff. Pedagogically, not all pedagogical techniques apply to science. There are techniques that would apply in a reading context. For instance, silent reading. Silent reading is something that may be appropriate in a science context, but really, science is not your reading program. It's not it's an opportunity to practice some of those skills. But in reality, when students are on reading college and career pathway nonfiction text at grade level, most oftentimes you're going to find that your students don't have the stamina to do that entirely on their own. And it's also, even if they do, it's not necessarily advisable, because the goal is to take the content off the page and to get that into discussion through things like Socratic dialogue. Finally, ELA and math are a necessary part of an NGSS classroom. Students are developing plans, they are using those plans, they are articulating their results, defending them through written and oral argumentation. And this is true, this is what I'm talking about too. My frame of reference is K-12, but again, as a teacher myself, I have experience K-12, but as a STEM specialist and, in the classrooms where, I spent a majority of my time in elementary and middle school, these things are still true and necessary. It's what changes from one grade level to the next is the depth and complexity of the type of content and also the ELA and math skills required. That brings us to the final point about what's unique and things you want to consider, is that past practices and policy can be a barrier to your implementation. I'll give you a few examples. About 40% of classrooms in the United States do not teach science at least once a week in elementary school. And right there, that's a barrier. Inadequate time on learning. And I'll show you in a second what time on learning looks like for these standards. Pulling students out during science for remediation in other disciplines or for music lessons or something like that, barrier. Teaching 3 units a year, alternating with social studies every other month, or this front half of the year is social studies, second half of the year. These are all policies that are not uncommon in schools, which are barriers to effectively implementing the standards. I would also add a few other things too around content-specific approaches, not heeding the recommendations of the standards creators and the National Research Council in having earth science, space science, physical science, life science, and so on, engineering, occurring within the same year. All of these things are super important. Time on learning. So this is sort of an average of what we're seeing across the states and recommendations, but it's also our experience. KnowAtom, as I said earlier, we not only have one of the few high quality NGSS designed K-8 curriculums, full scope and sequence for available, to districts and schools, materials, curriculum, professional development. But we also bring to the table with that the experience of thousands of classrooms implementing this, and our history of data and data improvements and best practices. And what we're seeing in the average state level recommendations really are accurate for what's necessary. If you are the kind of district that is value oriented, that is teaching to transform and to improve students' critical thinking skills as well as their scores. Scores being sort of the symptom, the outcome at the end. So think about that K-2 as needing about 2 hours a week, 3 to 5 about 3 hours, 6 to 8 about 4.5 hours, and high school about 5 hours. That's not a single block. Obviously, it's a parsed over multiple days. And the reason that you need that kind of time on learning is, again, this is a experiential set of standards. These are students that are not only engaging in nonfiction reading and Socratic dialogue, but they are then creating plans with their partners and carrying out those plans hands-on, gathering the data, using that data to reflect on what their ideas were. What was the, did my prototype actually solve the problem? Why or why not? How would we change it? What is this like compared to other approaches in the classroom? Okay. Next point here is that NGSS requires 3 levels of coherence. So, this is our third principle. So first principle was around the system of performance expectations, but also that system of shifts and instruction, habits and skills, kind of our second point. This is our third point, is the horizontal, vertical, and developmental coherence that's necessary for successful implementation. So horizontal coherence is all about classroom level consistency. So within the classroom, do your curriculum supports link with the instructional pedagogy that is going on in the classroom? Does the curriculum and supports set teachers up to be able to have a next generation inquiry environment where students are learning as scientists and engineers? The next piece is, what forms of assessments do you have? Are those linked up? Assessments, a quick side note here, the assessments under next generation science standards should be primarily formative assessments, sort of everyday low stakes assessment that is giving direct feedback to students so that they understand and are able to modify their approach, but also providing feedback to the teachers to adjust and inform their instruction. Okay, that's different than the high stakes, fill out the worksheet, right or wrong, A, B, C, D kind of approach. And those assessments obviously need to be assessing the next generation science standards in 3 dimensions. So it's not just assessing a performance expectation or group of performance expectations, but it's doing so in 3 dimensions so that we understand where students' strengths and weaknesses are. That's the key to informing instruction. The administrative goals and supports, what's important here in terms of horizontal coherence is that you don't have administrative goals which are 30 minutes of science a week, because you're not going to be able to have the majority of your students proficient with that sort of structural constraint. Another piece of it is when administrators are going on learning walks, not having a curriculum and standards that are expecting one thing and an administrator that's going around and saying something else. Why are these students making so much noise? Why are they out of their seats? Why is your standard not on the board? Why are you teaching 5 standards at once instead of just one? Because again, these standards are taught in clusters, not individually. So key here with horizontal coherence is supports within districts need to be reliably integrated for effective implementation. So think about those pieces as curriculum, professional development, and the materials to support that STEM inquiry environment. Vertical coherence is all about district level consistency. And what that means is that the district is designing its approach and communications around the state level standards, that the buildings within the district, so building to building, share goals and objectives and curriculum and pedagogy and so on. So a student whose family is chasing rent around the district ends up in one school, one part of the year, another school, next part of the year doesn't get 2 entirely different science curriculums, or potentially the same experience over and over again because everybody's at a different, they're doing it their own way, kind of freelancing. Well, I do unit 1 in September and unit, 5 in May. Shared district-wide scope and sequence prevents that type of systemic gap. And any kind of district-determined measures and time on learning policy needs to be, again, coherent and cohesive with the curriculum, professional development, and classroom pedagogy. And the big takeaway here is that districts need to be teaching and measuring what matters. Okay, it's not about ticking off boxes, but actually what matters for impacting student understanding, student skills, and student learning outcomes. And that is, when you look at the operational assessments under NGSS, that's what they're looking for. And I think where people are really at a loss right now is they're going out and buying, again, like I said earlier, ebooks and these little online programs and these modules that are now aligned to NGSS. And I had to laugh the other day. I saw on LinkedIn somebody had posted some company, just spent all summer developing the new NGSS curriculum, and now it's ready for September. If your curriculum for NGSS can be developed in a summer, that's not NGSS design curriculum. So, and because of all of these levels of coherence that are so important, this one is the one that is, I think, more critical than all the rest, because if you get this one wrong, if you get developmental coherence wrong, all the rest fall apart. It doesn't matter if you are horizontally and vertically aligned. And developmental coherence is all about nurturing the depth of students' understanding and skill one grade level to the next. So it's that idea that you are nurturing students as they transition from kindergarten to first grade to second grade and so on. And that is a kind of understanding by design across grade levels. What you're looking for here is grade-specific scope and sequence, grade-specific vocabulary and reading, and really not just grade-specific, but unit and lesson-specific. Grade-specific lessons which are driven by phenomena, anchor phenomena, and broken into investigative phenomena, and grade-specific articulation of content and skills. So again, you should be seeing in any lesson or unit multiple standards. And again, one of the places people fall down here is that they think there are grade-specific standards, and that means that that standard occurs only in that grade level. And that's completely false. There are grade-specific standards that are intended for mastery by the end of that grade level. But that doesn't mean that that standard only occurs within that grade. It should have been introduced in a prior grade level and reinforced in a future grade level. And so if you have phenomena-driven teaching and learning, you are going to have clusters of standards within grade for mastery, and then sets of supporting standards which are from prior and future grade levels that are kind of clustered around it. If you'd like to see what something like that looks like, you can go to KnowAtom.com/curriculum, and everything I'm talking about here is reflected in our curriculum. So you're welcome to take a look at a sample and see, because again, it's rather nuanced and can be kind of tricky to visualize. So what that does, though, is that the key takeaway here is developing a K-12 span that allows students to develop a deep understanding over multiple years. And so from any perspective, what it should look like is grade level specific. This is KnowAtom's elementary progression, kindergarten to 5. And what you see here is really what that scaffolding and nurturing process looks like. The horizontal, vertical, and developmental coherence at a very high level. And you can see how students are gaining depth of understanding in earth and space science over multiple years and even multiple units within the grade level, and how that leads all the way up through grade 8. Now, KnowAtom doesn't go into high school at this point, but it's great that we're able to nurture students kindergarten through 8th grade. And, and what's nice is we have the data to back us up. We see pretty significant gains in all types of districts, regardless of socioeconomics. It's really about, again, are you teaching, is your aim to teach to transform, or are you instead, at a highest level, really looking at compliance? Because I think the folks who are looking at compliance are the ones right now who are, again, struggling with some situations where they're adopting resources that aren't really NGSS compliant. And as the new testing takes root, depending on what state you're in, if it's not already operational, then what you are going to be up against is some disappointment. So as you look from one grade level to the next, the question is how do you take students through lessons, nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, students planning their investigations authentically, carrying them out, and then using the results of that investigative phenomenon, the data that they gather, how do they use that to form a conclusion, create an opportunity for sharing and debriefing? And again, we're able to do that K on up, but it looks different. The structures and supports are different. And that's the importance of not having sort of this, a module that you can kind of do anywhere, anytime. Somewhere between 3rd grade and 5th grade, because 3rd graders and 5th graders are very, very different developmentally. All right, so let's move to our next point. reimagining the professional support at school and district level. So key here is choosing NGSS resources that are fully designed for the National Research Council's vision for NGSS instruction K-12. And what that means is students in the role of scientist or engineer, authentic. It's not about doing a demonstration and then asking students questions about it, as much as it's about investigating real world context, like I mentioned earlier, something like hurricanes, flooding. What do we feel? What do we think about that? Why is that important to us? Let's discuss it. Let's connect with it. Let's create concept to concept, concept to self, concept to world connections in real time, right here in our class and discussion, because your ideas as students all matter. It's not about my ideas as a teacher as much as it's about your ideas and what you think about or how you create, evaluate, and analyze each other's ideas. Similar to teaching children about accountable talk, we're teaching children about Socratic dialogue. And what's key to these NGSS resources is that they create that opportunity and then give students the opportunity to take their ideas and manifest them in some way, to test them and to see firsthand the results and then use those results to reflect on their own thinking. So, it seems to have fallen out of vogue, this buzzword metacognitive, but nonetheless, that's what's going on here is sort of a metacognitive element within truly NGSS designed resources. Developing leadership is key. So what that means is that at each level within your district, at the teacher level, the principal level, the admin level, you should have a cadre of leaders, cohorts of leaders. And these are people who want to lead. It's not that you need one person from each school. It's you need anybody from each school and everybody from each school that you can get who wants to lead and who wants to play an infinite game, who wants to be better tomorrow than they are today. That's the people that you need to feed. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The next thing you need to do is you need those resources. Hopefully you've identified the right resources. Peak alignment guide, equip rubrics, those are what we use here. But they are also, they're developed by NGSS, Achieve, so on, the NGSS partners. Those are resources. Peak, PEEC, is a resource for looking at your district level alignment and sort of systems, and equip is for looking at specific lessons and tasks and their sort of level of alignment and fitness. So if you meet those guidelines, you have those resources in place, have your teams work the resources and then reflect on the challenges. It's very important that you work the resources as they're intended to be implemented. There are kind of two types of folks, which I'm going to talk about in a second, in groups, sort of school cultures. There's sort of the ease-in culture, and then there is the all-in culture. Leaders tend to be all-in. They may want to be ease-in, but they're willing to be all-in. Folks who are not in that leadership group are the ease-in types. They're not the risk takers necessarily. And it's very key that your professional supports be very hard on the problem and not on the person. Because the reality here is that for your implementation to be successful, one of the key principles that you have to adhere to is problem solving. Your professional support at a school and district level is all about problem solving. And unless the person is the problem, in which case you should be hard on the person, 9 times out of 10 or more, 99.9% of the time, it's not so much the person that's the problem. It's really, it's a problem of understanding, a problem of modeling, a problem of visibility of, I'm trying and doing everything I think I should be doing, but something's not right. I need other people's perspective and support, that sort of a thing. That's a legitimate problem, not a person issue. So keep in mind, key takeaway here, it's easier to refine instructional skills when you're working from a well-designed resource base. That's the key, okay? The reason I have this as part of talking about professional support is that if you don't share a game plan, if you don't have the instructional supports in place, or the resources in place, then what are you doing? You know, everybody's doing something different. Everybody's a freelancer. Everybody's scrambling for, you know, the cheapest Q-tips because they're paying out of pocket for it. And that's where the discussion goes, is where are the cheapest Q-tips? Not, you know, I taught this lesson just like you taught that lesson, but I had a different level of success with it. I have these, you know, types of IEPs in my class. I have English language learners. Here's what I'm encountering with them. And having somebody else be able to say, I have those same kind of kids, but I'm not having that. But I think this may be why. Why don't you come check out my class? I'd be happy to share, you know, with you and talk with you about that. And I'd like to get your feedback on it too. See, that's what a well-designed resource base allows you to do. It allows for higher order leadership. What goes into a well-designed NGSS curriculum? I threw a list up here for you. These are the minimums. This is what we build into our resources. And so again, when I was kind of saying earlier, that idea that, you know, created the curriculum for any grade level in the summer doesn't happen. Okay, it doesn't happen part-time after school. It takes years. KnowAtom, we've been at this for 13 years. And the way that we were able to be designed for these new standards today is that we followed that process all the way along, 2009 forward, looking at the reports, looking at the National Research Council's recommendations. We were producing curriculum at that time that was very much in line with the expectations of the National Research Council. Obviously, the final standards and so on have caused changes, but the reality is that the recommendations made by the National Research Council that the Next Generation Science Standards represent are purely great teaching and learning. That's it. It's good for kids, and it's great for teachers. Who doesn't want to be more authentic? Who doesn't want to be more engaged? What student doesn't want to try for themselves? And so as teachers, we need to learn to give up that control and have that release of responsibility. And a lot of that takes support. So, you know, teacher background, having unit goals, mastery objectives, lesson plans, a clear pedagogical approach, support for holding Socratic dialogue, grade level certified nonfiction reading. You know, all these pieces are necessary for teachers to see and understand the expectations and communicate them for themselves and for their students. But when I say things like grade level certified nonfiction reading, that's important because, you know, there's a lot of sort of gut sense that occurs within communities about what is an appropriate reading level for students. But the reality is that there are college and career pathway reading levels, certified reading levels. A student can have their own certified reading level, but reading material itself is certified or should be certified. Ours is certified. And the thing is that a student who is at grade level with a science text is most likely going to struggle a bit. Why? Because there's a challenge, and challenge is part of rigor. It's the opportunity for growth. But the key, though, is to make sure that your educators understand the nuances of this. Why is that important? So that nonfiction reading doesn't become silent reading and therefore become a barrier to student understanding if a student is below grade level reading, when something could be read aloud or discussed aloud and read aloud. And, you know, there's a lot of other little nuances around this too, which I won't get into right now, but it's very important, especially for students on ed plans or English language learners. And, you know, continuous formative assessment, that's one of the big shifts. The majority of assessment under these new standards is formative, not summative. And that class time is really an opportunity for students to express those higher order thinking skills, to manifest their ideas, compare their approaches to other teams, get feedback from other teams, their partners, from the teacher on not only their ideas, but their skills and progress towards meeting the expectations of the new standards. That's this coaching piece that's so important, okay? And when you may be familiar with this, but the National Research Council definition of effective science instruction is that it capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. It takes what they know and it builds on it. It's an intentionally nurturing process that provides students with the experiences to engage in the skills, those practices of science, and sustain their interest because they're involved. they're the ones in the driver's seat. So what you should see in your classrooms, if you have an effective implementation going on or going into it, be ready for this, communicate this, that it's not what you see on the left, but what you see on the right. Okay, it's not the teacher doing a demonstration and students being good little students watching and then going back and doing it again for themselves. Okay, it's about students who have read about something, who've discussed something, who are working together because they have an idea about how that something might be solved, that problem might be solved and what it is. So they're going to work together, come up with their best ideas, work with the resource base they have to try and create a solution, test it, use that information to reflect back on the solution. That's real learning. Just remember that learning is about adjusting one's framework. Okay, if I ask you to think of a swan, you might picture a white swan swimming around, feathers and so on. And if I said, no, that's not a swan, and I show you a picture, and you see, it's kind of similar, but that swan's entirely black. The black swan. Now, black swans actually exist. They are real. You can Google it. You can see a picture of one. Now, you may not have known that black swans exist. And so what you've just learned is that not all swans are white. In fact, there are swans that are black. So you have adjusted your framework of understanding about what a swan is and what it's like and what its characteristics are. So that in and of itself is learning. That doesn't happen in an environment where someone says, this is a swan, go back and, recite what a swan is. Over here, we think we know what it is, but let's really investigate. Let's test what our thinking is. And that's what's happening. Okay, moving on to our next point, establishing better collaboration. Point number 5 here, establishing better collaboration, networking, and partnerships. So as an individual, whether you're sort of the individual admin on this lone mission, been charged with it, or an individual teacher, these are the best recommendations I can make for you to really get the most out of your partnerships within district and outside of district. Number one is to try to get to know an innovator or a technologist. And what I mean by that is somebody who has really developed something, something that is patented and has been reproduced and is part of life around us. Sometimes, depending on your geography, that might be hard, but do your best to try to get to know or meet somebody like that. Watch their TED Talks if you can't meet them in person. Read their biography. Okay, read about somebody like Elon Musk. Read about somebody like Richard Branson. Okay, get to know how these people think. Okay, what are their creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills? Are they functioning off of remembering, understanding, and applying? And I can answer that for you right now. It's no. They're functioning off these creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, and they have this sort of thread of common characteristics in a sense, which are teachable. Some it's personality, but often teachable. And the next piece of it is to observe your peers and get to know their data. So get to know their instruction and get to know their data. And that's true as an administrator, but also as a teacher. How does that look? Well, it means, if you're taking somebody's advice from another district, you better, if you're going to take that hook, line, and sinker, you should know about their dirty laundry as much as you can. You should know what's really going on there. And the reason is that you don't want to make a decision that's based on something that's not what it seems to be. Okay, so that's really important. But when it comes to the role of innovators and technologists and observing classrooms and so on, what you really want to do is you want to put yourself in a position to ask yourself, how is what I'm seeing in the classroom going to produce the kinds of habits of mind, the critical thinking skills, and the science and engineering practices necessary to be like these innovators? Okay, so you can imagine walking into a classroom where the kids are all quiet in their seats doing their worksheets. Okay, how is that going to produce the kind of risk-taking, problem identifying, divergent thinking that you see in somebody like an Elon Musk or a Richard Branson. And the thing is that there's plenty of other people, people that are designing the buildings in your town. They're the ones that are also dealing with these kind of issues that unfortunately don't have a book necessarily written about them, but the characteristics are still there. And that's key, that these new standards are all about students being equipped to participate in that type of innovation. So try as an individual to step outside your school, your district, and your state, state's instructional culture, because that's the reality. Buildings form cultures as a result of that principal's sort of leadership style. Same thing happens at a district level, as a result of the community and the superintendency, the type of principals that are hired, that creates a kind of culture. But there's also a state level instructional culture in terms of how well and what is communicated from the state on down. Okay, and these next generation science standards are being used by dozens of states and almost dozens, about 20 states almost at this point. And that gives an opportunity for interoperability, for you to go and see apples to apples what somebody else is doing. And there are great things going on all over the country that people who in states that may feel a little high on their horse might be surprised to see and could improve. Now, as a school or district, ways to improve networking, partnerships, and collaboration. One, identify who wants to lead in your district. Find those all-in type folks. Also, kind of in the back of your mind, know who doesn't want to lead. Identify those ease-in type folks, okay? And then move forward by asking yourself and your team, how can we help those leaders go all in the way that they want to go all in, okay? Use that as an opportunity to leverage the teacher's experiences as they, let's say, like a KnowAtom example, we may have a district of 400 or 500 classrooms, and not everybody's an all-in type. Not every school building has an instructional culture that's going to support effective STEM instruction in the moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to help those school leaders. Okay, we're going to help them go all in. We're going to equip them, and then we're going to help them leverage their experience to grow a cohort within the district of on-target educators to create kind of a learning lab. And what's important about this is that we can use the growing pains that the all-in folks go through as an opportunity to for personal and group reflection among those leaders, and that sets them up now to not only reflect on their practices and improve themselves, but to also then support their peers. Okay, and so that cohort is a key piece of proof and support for the ease-in crowd who tends to come later, maybe a year or two, instead of the kind of like, well, we'll do half this year and then we'll do the whole thing next year, or we'll do a couple units. I have to say, if you do a couple units of something and it's like going well, you're probably not teaching the students the skills. That's not a proper kind of pilot. A proper pilot is really what I'm talking about here, is it's like creating that cohort piece. Some people go in all, wall to wall in a district, and that's fine if your district can do that. But if not, it's key. Get your folks stepping outside the norm, okay? Second to last point here. So principle number 6, tackle hidden curriculum equity issues. The obvious one that comes to mind for most folks is gender bias. So I call it bubbles, boys, and bow ties. So the depiction of the discipline, is it sort of the photo stock depiction? Do your classrooms and the instruction that you see in those classrooms, is it a photo stock depiction of science where, there's bubbling and oozing and, there may be cheering, and that's, great and engaging, but it's not necessarily students developing their content knowledge by developing and using science and engineering practices. Okay, they're not necessarily being scientists and engineers. They may be, carrying out something off the board, or kind of a pre-made lab or fill in the blank kind of a thing out of a workbook. The crash bang irrelevance. This is another one. So kind of links to the first one. Crash bang irrelevance, this is the kind of the boys thing. If we can blow it up, it's exciting, it's fun. That tends to lose girls. And what's interesting is that the research shows that as girls approach middle school, they begin eliminating science and engineering as a career choice, and it never returns. And so one of the reasons, I have no research to support this, but one of the reasons I believe that happens from my own experience as an educator and from what I've seen, my colleagues have seen in classrooms, is that girls in particular appreciate why something matters, and things being relevant and purposeful. And so we tend to see students, girls in particular, when we look at data in the life sciences, girls tend to do better than in other areas like physics. Well, that's not because girls are better at life science than physics. What happens is oftentimes when you then go back into the class to see how those disciplines were being taught, physics was all about crashing and banging things and blowing things up and making rockets, which some girls are into, but it's not always necessarily purposeful, at least not seeming. But when it comes to life science, things are connected. They're connected to the biology, to who I am and the world around me. You can't really divorce life science from relevance. And so, it's key. And then other kind of elements of gender bias that you may see is things like the esoteric, elitist / nerdy, again, back to the depiction of the discipline in a different form. It's the bow tie, I may get sued for saying this, but it's kind of that Bill Nye picture of science. And the reality is that there's a lot of scientists that don't wear lab coats or bow ties. They have boots in a pickup truck, and they are, working shorelines of rivers and streams and many other places. So keeping in mind here that to tackle hidden sort of equity issues, and you see this even in the, like cartoonish. This is another one of my big reasons that I dislike a lot of e-texts and things, is the cartoonish depiction of science. It's important to appeal to what's real and to let everyday phenomena, that anchor phenomenon, drive why the discipline matters, why the skills are useful, and why I should care about it. Okay, that's key. Why has to come first. Second kind of element of the curriculum equity issues is content access. Okay, if the curriculum is cartoonish, if the resources are cartoonish, they're not real world. It's an artist representation. It's not necessarily relevant, and it's not necessarily phenomena driven. It's important that students are at the center and that there's a release of responsibility. Students only really access the curriculum when they have control over it, or the content, when they have control over it and can dig into it and experience what works and what doesn't work. Science belongs on IEPs. If a student has an IEP for ELA or for math, then they should have some element of their IEP that has science included, because ELA and math are involved in these next generation science standards in the classroom. And beyond that, students are being held accountable in standardized testing, which means that they need the same test accommodations in science that they get in English language arts and math. This is a huge, huge area where districts shoot themselves in the foot. Okay, science isn't time for remediation and pullouts. Okay, it's not the time to go to music class or go get a music lesson or to go get extra help in math. That needs to happen in other parts of the day. Science is at the intersection of English language arts, math, and these innovative skills. And so to pull a student out of that is really a disservice to that student and prevents them from getting equal access to students who aren't being pulled out of class or who aren't on IEPs. Another key piece is understanding the role of nonfiction reading. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's important that your educators or you yourself as a teacher understand when independent reading and reading stamina, so first of all, when independent reading is appropriate, okay, what it means for a student to be, reading at grade level, okay, and the difference between reading a science text that's college and career pathway text and to be able to read that and understand it versus having top level reading stamina. Okay, these are, reading level, reading stamina, and silent independent reading are all different things. They cross over, they're interrelated, but they can have a negative impact on the student's access to content if an educator doesn't understand the difference and, quote, releases responsibility for reading to the student. If a student isn't, for instance, if they're an English language learner, releasing responsibility to a student to read silently and independently is inappropriate, most likely, especially if they're not at grade level. And the thing is that a teacher may feel like they're doing the right thing, but actually be doing a disservice to that student, okay, when all they needed to do was have a read aloud, and that's it, okay? So the goal here with content access is, making sure that students are accessing and communicating ideas. We need students to have equal access to ideas and to be able to communicate them, all right? And third piece and final piece of the hidden curriculum equity issues is that implementing well takes time, okay? So a lot of districts, you can walk in and start talking about this sort of a thing and something, oh, we don't have time for that. You don't know. We don't know my kids. We can't do that. If you hear people saying, you don't know my kids, well, that's already a personal bias about the kids. But, we can't do that. We don't have time. Well, if you don't take the time, then you're not giving your students access to the curriculum and to the content and to the skills and to the level of personal development that they need to be, for lack of a better term, competitive with their peers. Just because you don't have the time doesn't mean that somebody's going to give your kids a break when they enter the real world and have to work for a living, okay? They're held accountable like everybody else. And it's the people who have had the opportunity and the access that are most prepared. And so that's a tough situation. So keep this in mind. You need the time, but if the change is really happening, it's going to be awkward. It's going to be more time consuming. It's going to be a messy process. People are going to try things that aren't going to work. They're going to ask questions and they're going to fall flat. They're going to release responsibility and the kids are going to get out of control. They're going to, try to release responsibility and, materials management is going to go out the window. That's the awkward messiness. But you know what? Those are all things that we can learn from and recover from and move forward with. And what it reveals is the need for frameworks to be put in place in the classroom. Finally, a big one here, if change is really happening, the way that you used to do things is going to get in the way. And the more that it gets in the way, it just means that you have more of a transition that you're going through. If your experience in your school was very traditional in the ways that I mentioned earlier, more things are going to get in the way than if your school was more next generation. And this is more about making that switch complete, having the student truly be in that seat. You'll have less things in the way. So that's kind of the spectrum. But the thing is that if you encounter the awkwardness, the messiness, or things in the way, doesn't mean you should stop. It means that you need to recognize that and move, make changes to your pedagogy, your time on learning, that sort of thing. Not necessarily the curriculum. Now, one of the big questions that people ask is, what if my data takes a hit? Well, if it takes a hit, you need to investigate why. Okay, if your data takes a hit 2 years in a row, that should raise a flag. Now, if your curriculum is really designed for NGSS, then it's most likely, it's an implementation issue. It could be time on learning. It could be lack of professional development. It could be mixed messages from administrators versus the curriculum versus the all that kind of thing. There's a lot of things that can happen. It could be, just no fidelity to the program. So you have to go looking. You have to have an investigation into why. And then you need to use that information, not in 6 months, but immediately to begin, communicating the changes. And so I was just going to show you a couple of data sets just to see, what we typically see, and this is some examples from Massachusetts. where we've been involved, what we typically see is that states, like in this case, state average is about 50% advanced and proficient combined, and we tend to see significant gains in the first year. Again, for folks that are all in, they tend to see significant gains. For folks who are not all in or not willing to give up the ways of the past, we sometimes see flat or decline. But what's nice is that we don't tend to see that 2 years in a row, because we, as an organization, act as a partner to districts, and so we intentionally are involved to help understand and investigate and make the shifts necessary. So we'll go in and we'll have the discussions around, how is the nonfiction reading being done? How is Socratic dialogue being done? We will sit in on classes, we'll help coach teachers, and that's how you see double-digit gains. And so when you look, like this particular school was 72% low income, 75% high needs, and over the course of the first 2 years, they had a 51-point increase in their advanced and proficient scoring students, which is huge. I mean, you can see the needs improvement dropping from 61 to 30, and in fact, the lowest was 17%. Now, why these bumps in the road? Well, changes in teacher, changes in administrator, changes in access for us as professional development, professional developers to be involved. So, those things have an impact, but what's nice is there's still a positive trend. The kids haven't lost everything. Other examples, now this is 20% high needs, 7% low income. So this example was very urban. This is suburban. And again, going from state average to well above state average up into the 80s of advanced and proficient. And so when you look at situations like this, this is a tight team, all-in type folks, very type A, but, performing at the highest levels really in the state, top 20. Why aren't they 100% advanced and proficient? Well, reason is that there's still improvements to be made, and a lot of it is around the integration of English and language arts skills. And so that's where you start to see, this kind of, we call it an asymptote, where you approach something and it gets harder and harder to make similar gains. Well, in order to make large gains, it's about this integration. But when you look at these different kinds of gains, what I want to point out to you here is that it's helping students across the board in all different subgroups. And so what you see in red are state data targets for a school that we were working with in middle school. And you can see this particular school is like 95% low income, huge population of students who are non-native English speakers and so on. Nonetheless, you could see across the board students are being improved, and it's not, we don't get sort of points by helping the kids who, are only look or speak a certain way, or have certain access to resources. It's really across the board. So finally, and I'm going to end on this, I apologize, like I said, there's a lot of pieces here, and I will still take questions. The seventh principle is really about making internal communication and learning walks something that's regular and relevant. Final key to successful implementation. I guess the way to jump into this is why communication matters like this? Well, it's because people care most about what's quote unquote important. And what's important is what's important to them and to other people. So, some people, science is very important to them. So this is going to be a priority no matter what. They're the people who are trying to go out and do this all on their own no matter what. Other people are going to do things because they're expected to do it, because somebody has told them to do it. And in general, one of my principals said this to me years ago, and I really do believe it's true, is that people rarely achieve something that's not expected of them. They may accidentally do something, or they may be very internally driven, but by and large, if, as a team, you're trying to meet a goal, the people within that team are not going to achieve it if it's not expected of them. And so communicating those expectations is key. So what to do as an administrator or principal? Regularly and publicly articulate your vision for science, your perspective on the progress so far, and the goals that you have for the short term. Okay, so, hey, this is what we're all out to accomplish. This is what, the progress looks like we've had so far, good job. And in the next week or two, this is what our goal is. We need to make progress on this. We need to move the stake forward in this way. It's really important to be present as the administrator, the principal. You got to get into those classrooms and be human. Okay, these folks may be your employees, but they're really your team members. They are the folks in the trenches with you that you're responsible. They are producing the results that you are responsible for. So ways to do that that are really important for communication and learning walks and so on. Participating in the curriculum and resource decision making. Don't just delegate that to a team of teachers. It's important that there's a curriculum committee, that teachers are involved in decision making, but you are a key decision maker too. And if you don't have a vision and you can't articulate, and you don't understand the resources that people have chosen and why, you're fighting an uphill battle to start with. Secondly, understand how those resources are designed to be implemented. Okay, you may have a picture of science instruction that does not match the way your resources are designed to be implemented, which means that you are going to be communicating something contrary and defeating when it comes to implementing that material. Third, attend the teacher's professional development. If you can't attend all of it, try to attend at least half of it in the session. You need to be there to show, one, that you're bought in and you understand too, but also that this is a priority. Okay, that this is important. Number 4, you have to have your ear to the rail and be a liaison between your leaders and the resource provider. Our best customers and our greatest data gains, when we see data gains double digits, is really difficult for us. I mean, we have some folks who this year, we're seeing 30, 40-point gains in a single year. That's huge. That's unheard of in public education. Why do we see that? Because we're partners to districts. We bring all that hand in glove materials, the curriculum, the professional development together, but we work with administrators, teachers on the ground, not in professional development as a day, but as a process. And so those administrators who, hear things, grumbles and things coming up, and pick up the phone and go take a look and, act as a first responder, and then act as a liaison between us and their teams, they're the ones who get the fastest, greatest results. And it's important that, you're that calm first responder, and don't be afraid to ask the question, to make the call, and to call in the experts when you need to. So as a teacher, what to do is to really take advantage of every PD opportunity, to ask any and all questions, to focus first on understanding the why things are being done this way, why the changes are necessary, build a framework of understanding of the spirit of the standards and the vision of the National Research Council and others involved with it, and then the how. Okay, how am I going to achieve that in the class? I recommend keeping a journal of your progress and your feedback you get from other teachers, your principal or someone. I think that's important because sometimes people give conflicting feedback, and it's nice to have a record and be like, hey, we had this discussion before and you told me something completely different. I understand people's perspectives change, but, what are you really going for? Help me understand that. The other piece is to understand your own progress and that you are making forward steps on a journey, because you have to celebrate the successes. This is not the kind of thing that happens overnight. And finally, use the journal, use your visits with peers to reflect on your practice. That's really important. The rate of change that you're going to see in the classroom is going to be a result of your reflection on your practice. So if you wait for somebody to come in and reflect for you, and that's true if you're a principal or a curriculum dean or a science curriculum coordinator or a teacher, when you encounter challenges, you need to reflect on it, and then you need to seek the perspective of others, some who maybe in the trenches in your district and those outside, and also involve the resource providers, because again, folks like KnowAtom, we're in that position where we're doing this in thousands of classrooms all over the country. We see things before anybody else sees them. We know they're going to be an issue, and we're happy to share that information when it's welcome. So that's really key. And think about one little piece here that I kind of skipped over quickly is, as administrator, as principal, kind of backing up a little bit, but thinking about this as a teacher too, when administrators or principals come into your classroom, learning walks are an opportunity for low stakes formative assessment. That really what should be happening there when an administrator comes into your classroom or when you go into a teacher's classroom, it's not just a drop-in look around. You need to stay there 15, 20 minutes, really, if you can, the entire period. Usually, I insist that our folks are in the classroom for the entire period. We want to see what happens from the kids come in the door to when they leave. We don't want to come in having missed something. And the reason is that we want to assess where that teacher's skill set is at, but we also want to understand where the student's perspective is at and what their skill set is. And we want to understand what it feels like to be a student in that class. Because the key to these learning walks is really being the voice of the student. Back to what I said earlier about get to know a technologist, get to know an innovator, somebody who's actually solved a problem by creating something that they had to then, sell. What's key about that is that, when you sit in that class and you see the worksheets go out and everybody's being quiet and somebody makes a noise and they're being, told to be quiet and so on and so forth, you can feel right away that as a student, there's nothing engaging about this. It doesn't seem important. What's relevant about it? Or you get up and you're in a classroom and you have somebody who's giving a lecture and you can't even follow it. You're like, what is this about? And the kids are being disrespectful and all this sort of thing starts happening. It's like, well, this is all falling apart because of how it feels to be a student. In that format, my opinion, my presence doesn't matter as a student. I have no ownership. There's no release of responsibility. I'm not trusted. I can't interact. I can't see. I have no experience. This isn't real world to me. Okay. So all of those things as an administrator, those are things that you need to bring up to the teachers that you observe and be the voice of that student. Now, that doesn't mean that every class is going to be fun, right? We need to develop grit in our students. Okay. Class needs to be challenging. But the reality is that your coaching is key in helping teachers to appropriately challenge students. So not releasing responsibility too soon and not releasing responsibility too late. Okay. All right. So we covered a lot of ground. I'm going to take some questions. Thank you for those of you who were able to hang on. I know we had an awful lot of folks in this webinar. And if you have to bail and you have a question, drop it in there and I will try to write you back, or feel free to reach out. I'll give you my contact information here in 1 second. So the 7 principles are realizing, I'm just going to quick recap, that NGSS is a system of performance expectations that require a system of instruction, that it's all about shifting students, teachers, and administrators' habits and skills, and that the horizontal, vertical, and developmental coherence of your approach to the standards is a key success factor. It's going to require reimagining school and district supports and really what curriculum is and isn't, the difference between curriculum and standards, that you're going to need to establish perhaps better collaboration, network, and partnerships, and ones that help elevate the skills and put the students in the role of scientist and engineer. And finally, making the communication of what the vision, the trajectory, and the progress is towards your goals, something that's regular and relevant and actionable for teachers and students as well, and any other stakeholders that you have as part of that instructional community, reading specialists, and so on. So this is my contact information. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'm going to grab a couple questions. If you want to learn more about KnowAtom, you can check us out, KnowAtom.com. Follow us on Facebook. If you found this helpful, we'd love a 5-star review. That'd be great. We're on Twitter and elsewhere as well. We have a huge resource base on our website. You can also, if you want to take a look at curriculum samples, you can take a look at the first unit of each grade level online, the teacher's piece and the student's reader, K to 8. And what you would see there is only a month's worth of content, because we have, with the exception of kindergarten, we have 9 units a year, and the purpose of that is we have monthly themes. It's very tightly articulated to the standard. So just to preface, if you are looking at something and what is this, that's what it's about. All right, I can grab a couple quick questions here. Okay, so some folks have questions about the time on learning. And what I'll say about the time on learning amounts that I had shown earlier, some folks are saying, most class periods in high school are only 50 minutes a day. Well, that's a district choice. That's a school choice. And so unfortunately, our choices have consequences. And I'm not sure what position you're in as a teacher or an administrator, but what a lot of people are doing is they're going to waterfall schedules. And so that way they have a 6 or 7 day rotation, plus or minus, and they're able to get larger blocks of time and, shift things around in such a way that they're able to get that time on learning in over the course of a week. Because the reality is that at middle school and high school level, there's a lot of what we call frictional loss, where, you can have 5 50-minute periods, but really the core valuable learning time is less than 30 minutes in that 50-minute period, because there's 10 minutes of transition in and out. Now, if you were to have, a 2-hour period or an 1.5-hour period, you don't have the transitions to deal with. You have fewer transitions. And so that's a way that you can deal with it. And the reality is that sometimes people go, oh my goodness, 1.5 hours or a 2-hour block. Our kids could never sit through that. I can't keep people like that. Well, that is a sign that there's a problem with curriculum or pedagogy. In a science class, this should be active learning, problem-based learning, hands-on learning. There's never a problem keeping, students engaged in that. Not to say that students don't have social emotional issues and whatnot, but by and large, that's not an issue. Oftentimes, where you get pushback with this type of scheduling is that it's the math and the ELA people who say, I can't keep them in the room that long, and that's an issue of pedagogy or curriculum and math or ELA. So, science isn't the only one that suffers from that type of issue, but we need to deal with the problem, right? It's not an excuse for not having proper scheduling. Some folks have asked a little bit about, let's see here if I can articulate this a little differently or more clearly. How to integrate KnowAtom content into schools or districts that cannot or will not invest in the program. And, that's a tough one. I'm a teacher myself. I, taught for the better part of 10 years. Everybody here at KnowAtom is a teacher by background in some form. And, I had the luxury of being able to perform at some of the highest levels in my state and in the country. And even at the top level, number one in the state. And the reality is that I couldn't do that without the support of my school and district. And I don't believe that teachers should be outspending their own money to teach their students. That is not my idea of community. And I think that that's an equity issue for students and for parents who don't have a choice but to live in a community who makes, those types of instructional decisions. So, that's, I guess, not answering your question, except to say that, what you need to do is you need to help your leaders understand, your community understand the importance of these types of resources and the kind of opportunities that it presents students in terms of college and career options. Our goal at KnowAtom is not that every child becomes a scientist or an engineer. Our goal at KnowAtom is that every child be equipped to think critically, and we mean specifically to create, to evaluate, to analyze what's around them, and so that they can make informed choices and that they have, options in any college or career path they choose, because those skills are necessary no matter if you're a marketer, a day laborer, a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, a PhD scientist. Okay, so unfortunately, that's that. If you're super motivated, what I would say is, look to the friends of your public school system. There's oftentimes a grant type committee in town that wants to give teachers money to try innovative things, and I would recommend writing a grant. And if you do go that route, we do have support resources for you here at KnowAtom, where we will do free grant reviews and help coach you in that process if you're implementing KnowAtom resources. So that's, I guess, maybe the one piece I can say there. A few more questions that are in the key. Here's one about the churn of administrators and turnover in many public schools. How would you suggest that the discussion of speed and implementation and student achievement be like with teachers? So if I understand this question, it is if you've got a lot of turnover, what's a realistic implementation plan speed-wise, and what should the kids be expected to achieve? So the issue of churn is tough. When we see it, it's quite 10 to 20% churn, so say a 15% average, is not uncommon. Charter schools and urban schools tend to have higher churn in our experience than non-charter, non-urban districts. But then if you look at rural communities, and by rural I'm saying, several hours from the nearest city, you can oftentimes see churn there as well, because people are traveling a great distance, and to find qualified educators can be quite a challenge. And so, beggars can't be choosers in these cases. The direct answer to your question is that if your resources, so the way that our resources are designed as a system operating within a system. So we designed our resources. I started when I founded the company 13 years ago. I was my background is an urban educator. I was also an urban student, a first-generation college graduate myself, and had kind of seen both sides of the coin as what it means to be on the receiving end of a common urban education and the production end of a common urban education. And, churn is part of that. And so the way that KnowAtom operates as a system within a system is to make sure that every teacher can operate well independently if they are willing to open the resources we give them and try. That we give them every hands-on material, every access to coaching. We fulfill all the live materials. We do all of this. The only thing we don't do is show up in the classroom to teach the class and to meet the students' needs and to coach them through that every moment by moment. That is the unique value add of a teacher, which nobody can ever replace, robot or otherwise. And so, so the thing is that our resources for new teachers, and oftentimes new teachers to districts can be the most successful in this sort of churn scenario, because if they're entirely new, they don't have to unlearn some bad habits. So that's something that's great, because obviously when you have a paradigm, a certain perspective and way of doing things, that it's like a habit that's hard to give up. So that's, what we see now. Those data charts that I showed you, those are from, everyday districts. The urban one with the kind of ups and downs, new faces and changes and all of that. The rate of change that you should expect for students, there's not like a specific number that you can say, this is guaranteed by any means. But what I would say is that if you have a critical mass of leadership and a great system like ours in place, and professional development is occurring, and communication is occurring with the regularity that we recommend, the kind of change that we typically see is anywhere from 10 to 25 points in the first year. And then we can see that typically sustained in double digits for 2 to 3 years. Now, again, you can't get beyond 100%, right? So you can't sustain what's not there to be had. But really what we tend to see is over that sort of 3 to 5 year implementation timeline, districts start to reach into the 70s and 80s and some into the, low to mid 90s, advanced and proficient. So that's what we expect to see. Now, the thing is that there are a lot of struggles along the way. And so depending on how well a community responds to, struggles, these kind of shifts that are necessary, that's the factor. So when you ask about rate of change, I would say that the rate of change of student scores is directly proportional to the capacity of the district to adapt. Okay, so if your district has a very low capacity to adapt for any number of reasons, then I would expect a lower rate of change, much lower. And it could even be negative, because if a district won't adapt, and then you put a resource in place that requires adapting pedagogy and other methods, so on, then you can see people being less successful. So that's kind of how it rolls. Some folks asked some questions around, let's see here, what a weekly schedule looks like. Somebody asked, and what a weekly schedule looks like, so I'll pull up the slide. A weekly schedule kind of looks like this. If you were thinking about middle school, nonfiction reading, followed by Socratic dialogue, followed by students planning their investigations, carrying out their investigations, and then forming conclusions, sharing and debriefing. So if you picture like a 5-day week, but the reality is that everybody, I think, naturally wants sort of a linear, day 1 is nonfiction reading, day 2 is Socratic dialogue, day 3 is, and so on. The reality is that skillful teaching is 20 minutes of nonfiction reading and jumping into your Socratic dialogue for the next, 10 to 15, and then picking up the next day and doing 20 or 30 minutes of Socratic dialogue and transitioning into students planning their investigations independently in their teams. And so that's kind of how it works. If you're thinking about scheduling, let's say at an elementary level, so what I'm describing here is more of a high school or middle school level where you have science every day of the week for 40 to 50 minutes, or 40 to 60 minutes. If you're talking about an elementary level, what you're seeing is 15 or 20 minutes of reading, and then maybe later that day, 20 to 40 minutes of Socratic dialogue, or the next day, and then the day after that, an hour of students breaking into their teams and planning their investigations and going through checkpoints with the teacher. And so that's, again, release of responsibility is important. And so, when you add 20 and 20 in an hour and then another 20 and, 15, you end up with, 2.5 to 3 hours of time on learning over the course of the week. And of course, if you're dealing with kindergartners or first graders, it's much smaller because you're looking at, 10 to 15 minute read alouds, a 15-minute circle discussion, a 15-minute, more structured, but independent students, planning their investigations, and then, 20 to 30 minute hands-on, carrying out the investigation, and then a 10 or 15 minute, forming conclusions and debrief. So, the chunking occurs, but it's important that it happens in close proximity and over the course of a week that way. Some other questions that have come up here. Some folks asking about coherence in other disciplines like math or ELA, and does that need to come before you can attempt to implement NGSS classes? I would say no, it doesn't need to come before. And the reason is that the operations required are very basic. Really, it's more about the math. So if you're from a Common Core state, it's about the math Common Core practices. So in the math Common Core practices are very similar, almost like complementary, like a mirror image of the science and engineering practices in a lot of ways. So, the question is a good one, because many people fall prey to the idea that you can't do you can't do NGSS the way that it's envisioned and the way that it is designed until students, have reached a certain level in math or ELA. Think of it the other way around, that in order that teaching science is now an opportunity to improve math and to improve English language skills, and specifically the Common Core math practices. And in ELA context, it's speaking and listening standards, it's reading informational text standards, it is, I'm drawing a blank, but down the list, process writing, technical writing, and so on. So all of that now has a home in science. And so when it was difficult to teach those things in a math class or an English language class because there was no hands-on, real-world relevant application, now science is that opportunity. So think about it this way. Students now have an opportunity to live a word problem, to actually live it, to see its relevance right from the very get-go, and to create that kind of word problem of their own, gather the data, and reflect on it. That's really what's going on, instead of, two trains traveling down a track in opposite directions and so on. Totally irrelevant, right? But hey, flooding, this is where flooding happens. Look at it. Why do we care about that? Have you ever seen flooding? Have you ever experienced that? How would you feel if your home or your car or your business was affected by flooding? What's a problem that we see here that we might be able to solve? Okay. How would you go about trying to solve that if this is the resource base that's available? Create your plan, right? And then you carry out that plan. Now that I carried out my plan, I have this data. The way that I thought that problem would be solved, it doesn't actually work that way. Here's why. And here's the data to support that claim. Okay, that is living the word problem in science, developing the math and the ELA skills in science that can't be done in any other way in a math or an English language arts class the way that they're traditionally done. It's a great question. Folks are asking questions like, what kind of investment are you looking at from a school perspective? If this is a difficult one to answer. And the reality is, if you have implemented or invested in any kind of kit science program like FOSS or STC or something like that, textbook purchases, it's along those lines. $50 to $100 per seat is not unreasonable. But the reality is once you make that upfront investment, people often forget about there's a recurring cost because somebody needs to maintain those resources, that there are consumable elements and so on. And so what KnowAtom does is that KnowAtom actually maintains all of that for districts. So in year one, districts will buy their curriculum binders, their online access, because all materials are also available electronically, through Google Classroom and otherwise. But they'll have durable tools like hammers, and digital scales, and infrared thermometers, and then consumable pieces like tin foil and batteries and sand and cardboard and tubes and all kinds of crazy things that get modified or consumed. Chemicals get consumed as a result of experimenting or prototyping. Those consumable portions, in KnowAtom, we treat the paper readers as consumables so that all of the close reading strategies that are being taught in ELA reading time can be extended to the science time on learning. Especially that it's especially important at the elementary levels, but even at a middle school level, it's key. Identify main ideas, underlining, circling, so on. We also print all of any kind of print materials that are necessary are in there too. So we treat those as consumables. People can use them electronically, so that's not an issue. But those consumable portions are something that districts need to think about. And it's just how it is. And if you look at a college, someone who gets a degree in nuclear physics or biology, they pay lab fees, and the cost of their degree exceeds the cost of an English major or a history major degree. And why is that? Because tools and consumables are a part of that discipline. It's necessary. And the state mandates that every child learn science and engineering in school. So it's inexpensive discipline to do it well, and we owe it to children to do it well. And we owe it to our communities to be honest about what the real costs are and not put that on teachers. Because the reality is that the average teacher spends $1,000 a year on materials for their classroom. But the range is anywhere from, $0 to $5,000 a year per teacher. And that's just unbelievable to me. You would not go to a hospital and accept that the doctor runs out to his car to get the gauze, and the IV lines. We shouldn't expect that teachers run out to Walmart and spend their weekends cutting bottles because they're a teacher and that's acceptable. And the reality is that is not the foundation of sustainable change. So a couple more questions, and unfortunately I'll have to wrap up here. A lot of really great questions. Will there be access to this webinar online? Yes, we will send folks a link to the recording after, and it takes probably 24 to 48 hours to turn that around. Keep an eye on your junk mail, spam folders. If for some reason you don't see it, feel free to email back to the name on the invitation you got, Jennifer, maybe myself, Mary Ellen, or feel free to just go on KnowAtom.com and click Contact Us. We also list all of our webinars and ebooks on the resources section of KnowAtom.com, and we keep a blog as well, and I personally blog quite often. You're welcome to subscribe there. It doesn't cost anything. Obviously, our curriculum and materials cost something. That's how we keep the lights on. But in terms of the resources on our website, it doesn't cost anything. And we'd love if you'd stay in touch. And others saying thank you and so on. So yes, if any other questions come up, unfortunately, I'm going to need to go now. Feel free to reach out. My phone number is 617-475-3475, and my extension is 2001. Again, my name is Francis Vigent, and my email address is fvigeant@knowatom.com. And it's been a pleasure, and good luck if you are in a position of implementing or considering piloting or implementing next generation science standards for the fall or at some point in the future. I hope you'll continue to stay in touch and reach out to us and consider our resources and expertise and helping be a partner in that process. Take care. Thank you now. Bye-bye.